This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for May 28th, 2022. There have been a lot of developments and things are moving very quickly in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. So let's just jump right into it. Let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is very pro-Ukraine. And I use it because if it's going to show you Ukraine losing, then I think that speaks volumes on it in and of itself. I always start here in southern Ukraine. Kherson, this is a city Russia took very early on in the conflict. They are consolidating socioeconomic and political control over the city, and they are preparing the battlefield toward the direction of Nikolaev. Beyond that is Odessa and then Transnistria. And as I've said many times before, they are not going to take Nikolaev now because the primary objective is the Donbas region. They are just holding their ground now and consolidating control over Kherson. There's also Mariupol. They've been consolidating control over Mariupol since mid to late April. That's when the fighting actually stopped. The Azov battalion or regiment, whatever you want to call them, the Nazis, they were hiding underground in the Azovstal steelworks, and they have since unconditionally surrendered. All along this line, it's remaining relatively static, but then from Donetsk city northward, we are seeing a lot of progress. This dark red line is the line of contact when this conflict started in late February. So anything red that you see crossing that line, that is progress Russia has made since then. It doesn't seem like a lot, but I'm going to explain that in just a minute. There was a major breakthrough here very recently in Popasnya, the city here that was taken earlier this month. And this salient has just grown in all directions since then. This is the main cauldron here, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. This is a built-up urban area. Russian troops are already working their way into these cities. And then this gap here is closing. It's getting smaller and smaller by the day. And Russian artillery can already more or less cover all of this area. Another major breakthrough since my last update is here, Lyman city. This is a city that has been taken by Russia. It's an important rail junction, and it allows Russian troops to begin moving closer and closer to Sloviansk. This is a much larger and more significant transportation hub. It's going to be key to controlling the eastern part of Ukraine that Russia is working in right now. And then if we go northeast to Kharkov and we look at the Great Kharkov Offensive, Ukrainian forces stretched themselves out in what was essentially a political stunt. It was not a military offensive. It was a political stunt. They took pictures near the border with a mock-up of a border marker, and then they've been being pushed back by Russia ever since. And they're all stretched out and getting shelled by Russian forces. And it's a microcosm of this conflict in general, things being done and decided on for political reasons, ignoring the obvious folly in terms of military operations, both tactical and strategic. Now, what I usually do at this point is I'll go to a Pentagon briefing, but I want to explain first why everything was taking so long and why there's all of this sudden progress. Now, I've done a previous video. It's called, why is it taking Russia so long? And I referenced the work of Jacob Dreizin of the Dreizin report. He did 2 videos now explaining extensively how this all works, how Ukraine built its defenses up over the last 8 years, how it's not just a very significant line, but it's also done in depth. There's layers of it. He's done a second video now explaining how Russia is dismantling these defensive lines and why, as that process continues, it gets faster and faster. The progress becomes faster and faster. I will put the link to both of those videos in the video description below, but I'll do a quick analogy. Have you ever seen ancient warfare depicted in a documentary or in a movie, the shield wall, where the soldiers have their shields overlapping the soldier next to them? It's a very strong formation. It offers tremendous protection to all of those soldiers as long as the shield wall holds. If you knock out 1 or 2 of those shields, then it allows spears, arrows, swords to start working their way in depth into that formation. And it creates a cascade effect where at first it's just a couple of soldiers. Before you know it, the whole formation is cracked open and the enemy is able to attack at all different angles. The strength, the integrity of that defensive formation has been compromised. That is essentially what's happening, but just on a massive scale, these entrenchments and fortifications that Ukraine has built up over the last 8 years. Now, another thing I want to point out about that is they don't have time to reestablish a defensive line that significant anywhere else in Ukraine. That took 8 years to build. They don't have 8 years to build a new one. This is going way too fast for that to happen. They're already trying to build defensive lines further in Ukraine because they see how it's going in the Donbas region. It's not working out for Ukraine. So this is what's going on in the Donbas region. That is what's actually going on. And now let's talk about what the Western media is claiming is going on and what the Pentagon is claiming is going on. Now, I want to talk about this podcast. Actually, let's just take a look here. It'll be in the video description below in case you want to listen to it. War on the Rocks. This is very pro-US, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine with Michael Kaufman and Ryan Evans. It's almost weekly. And it's very interesting to listen to this from when this conflict began to today, how their tone has changed, how they're constantly flip-flopping to try to rationalize what's actually going on and their belief or their desire to believe that Ukraine is winning. They're talking about losses in the Donbas region. The first time I've ever heard them admit that Ukraine is suffering significant losses. They admit that. And they admit that they're losing territory, and they would only give up that territory if they were suffering significant losses. Ryan Evans says, well, that's okay because, you know, we've got all this Western military equipment coming in, and we could just build another army deep in the interior, away from the front lines. Once that's ready, we'll just send it in. And Michael Kaufman, who's supposed to be some sort of military expert, he agrees. He says, yes, we can build up these reserve brigades. Now, I want to kind of break down why that makes zero sense. First of all, they already tried to do this. The US already tried to do this. They already tried building armies out of thin air in a neighboring country and then send them in to go win one of their proxy wars. This happened in Syria. And actually, this is an article from 2015. DW, US begins training Syrian fighters in Jordan to tackle Islamic State. But actually, it was for the proxy war against the Syrian government. And this article says, a spokesman for the government of Jordan said military training for the first group of 90 Syrians began several days ago. About 350 of the 450 coalition forces involved in conducting the training are U.S. troops. The training is being carried out at 4 sites in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. The Pentagon has said it will take 3 years to train and arm more than 15,000 opposition forces. The article also said U.S. Congress passed legislation authorizing the military to arm and train moderate Syrian rebels and approved $500 million for training about 5,000 fighters over the next year. 3 years to train 15,000 fighters, which never happens. They never built this army in Jordan or in Turkey. What they were doing was building very small units. They were building them up and they were sending them in, and they lacked the strategic capacity to fight a combined arms war against the Syrian Arab army and its allies, which included Iranian forces, Lebanon's Hezbollah, and also the forces of the Russian Federation, their air force and specialized ground forces. So, I mean, they were just sending them into a meat grinder, and they had no hope at all of succeeding. This strategy made no sense. It was being done in complete contradiction to reality. You cannot build an army out of thin air. It doesn't work that way. In relation to Ukraine, I want to show you this. This was from the U.S. Department of Defense. DoD leaders say training Ukrainian forces is paying dividends. This was May 4th, 2022. That didn't really age very well. And what they were trying to say is that all of this training over the last 8 years, and look how well Ukraine is doing. They're winning. They're winning the war. And now you have people saying, well, we need to build a new army because the one we built over the last 8 years is being destroyed. This article, it says, from the beginning of that training back in 2014 until January 2022, the 7th Army Training Command had trained a total of 23,000 Ukrainians in Yavoriv. And Yavoriv is where that training site was that Russia launched multiple cruise missiles at and more or less destroyed. And so there's no more training taking place in Ukraine, nothing of any significance. It's all being done outside of Ukraine. That 23,000 over the last 8 years, that was all done under relatively ideal conditions. Now you're in the middle of a war. You do not have the ability to train soldiers to the same quality, the same time frames, the same scale. None of that is possible now. So if the army you built up over the last 8 years under relatively ideal conditions could not do the job, whatever you think you're going to be doing deep inside Ukraine, this new army you're going to build, is not even going to come close to performing the way this current army that's being dismembered by Russia is doing. It's not even going to come close. Michael Kaufman and his idea of them building up these reserve brigades is pure fantasy. It didn't work in Syria. It's not going to work in Ukraine. One other thing I want to point out is that, let's just say you have enough men for a brigade, you have enough equipment for a brigade. It's not a matter of just sticking them together and sending them out into the field. They need to be properly trained. An entry-level infantryman, let me just show you this. This is from Marine Times. Here's what the Corps' new school of infantry training looks like. And what they're talking about is a 14-week course. As a U.S. Marine, you take 3 months of basic training, and then another 2 months just to become an entry-level infantryman. Just infantry alone. We're not talking about tankers. That could take half a year to train a new tanker. Or artillerymen, or soldiers tasked with drone operations, or rockets and missile launchers. All of this takes a long time just to create entry-level soldiers. Then you have to consider, right now, Ukraine is losing its officers and its non-commissioned officers. And that experience and that training, which takes years to gain, that's gone. You can't fast forward that. It will take years to replace. Years that Ukraine does not have. That army that the US helped Ukraine build up over the last 8 years, it is being destroyed much faster than 8 years. Some people say that you can speed all of this up. You can speed this process up, which is true, you can. But then they're going to have even less training and less practice before being thrown right into the middle of an actual war. It doesn't make any sense. So people worried about this torrent of weapons flooding into Ukraine, and the idea of building an army out of thin air in the middle of Ukraine to then go to the Donbas region and retake everything. It's not going to happen. And Michael Kaufman, during this podcast, I mean, he admits that this conflict is not going to, he admits a lot of things that I have not heard him admit in the past. He admits that this conflict is not going to degrade Russia's military combat power the way a lot of people think it's going to, which is evident, is self-evident. So now let's take a look at these Pentagon briefings. I like to go over at least one. This time there's two. This one, Pentagon Press Secretary John F. Kirby holds a press briefing May 27th, 2022. And I'll also go over this one. Senior defense official holds a background briefing May 26th, 22. Now this one with John Kirby, if you go all the way down to the bottom, there's actually a video, and I suggest people watch this video. This was his last briefing as Pentagon spokesman. He's going to do some job over at the White House involving communications. I would not want to be John Kirby trying to tell the Western media, why this fantasy of Ukraine winning is no longer viable. I wouldn't want to be him. And if you watch this last briefing he gave, you're going to start to get a sense of just how unenviable that job is. And what they're talking about almost the entire time is these multiple launch rocket systems. This is the next wonder weapon that the Western media and Western governments are floating around as the game changer. As a matter of fact, I mean, here, let's look at this Newsweek article. Explained, the game changer weapon Ukraine wants, US resists sending. And they're talking about the multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS. So it's the next wonder weapon, the next game changer. But it isn't, is it? It's not. The Javelins and the Stingers, and now the M777 howitzers, they haven't done anything to change what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine. And during this briefing and the other Pentagon briefing that I referenced, they admit that almost all of this equipment is at the front line right now It's making no difference. They're still losing cities. They're still fleeing. They're still dying by the hundreds every single day on the front lines there in the Donbas region. So they're asking, where are these multiple launch rocket systems? Why isn't the U.S. giving Ukraine these systems? They're begging for them. They need them. They're losing the Donbas region. Why aren't you sending them? I mean, you have to listen to it. They're almost screaming at John Kirby about where are these rocket launchers. Now, the U.S. has HIMARS and M270s. They're two different types of rocket launchers. There's different types of rockets that you could launch from each one of these. The U.S. has about 400 HIMARS that they could potentially draw from to give Ukraine, and they have about 1,000 of these M270s. And these M270s, they're a tracked vehicle, so it's the same problem with all of these heavy weapon systems. They're vehicles with rocket launchers attached to them. They will require specialized maintenance, the M270s, especially because they're a tracked vehicle. And any tracked vehicle, you cannot just drive it across Ukraine. You have to put it on a flatbed or on a train, which presents many problems. The HIMARS system it's a wheeled system, so that's a little bit better. They're both systems that do not give Ukraine any sort of capability that Russia doesn't already have in vast abundance. It's also not a capability that Ukraine didn't have at the beginning of this conflict. Back at the end of February, Ukraine had its own rocket artillery. They had all of these systems similar. A lot of them were similar to the ones Russia is using. A lot of them are relatively outdated compared to what Russia is using. But they had these systems and they got destroyed, and they did not help Ukraine stop Russia. So the US sending a totally new system that they've never trained on, that they don't know how to maintain, that have special requirements that they're going to have to somehow figure out, that is actually not going to help them. It is not going to give them any sort of capability that will even remotely change anything on the battlefield. Anything that the HIMARS or the M270s can give Ukraine, Russia already has. They have Russia has multiple systems, multiple launch rocket systems. They've got the Grad system. They've got about 1,000 of those in service and 2,000 more in storage. They have the Uragan and the Smerch and the Tornado systems. Each one of these, they have like over 100 or hundreds of these, each one. And they also have the short-range ballistic missile, the Iskander. They have the same capabilities of anything the U.S. is going to give Ukraine, and then some, and they just have way more of them. So what the U.S. is going to do for Ukraine is not a game changer. It'll take, here, this is the U.S. Army's official website, multiple launch rocket system crew member. It's 4 weeks of training just for an entry-level operator. 4 weeks, and then again, you have to deal with maintenance, you have to deal with the computer systems, everything is computerized, and you need to have crew members who are in decision-making positions, which requires more experience and more training. And so it's not that easy. It's not as easy as just sending some vehicles there and then pushing buttons and making the Russians go home. It doesn't work that way. It's not an episode of G.I. Joe. At one point during this briefing, one of these journalists, they say, "So I want to ask you that why I haven't heard a note of optimism, of unqualified optimism about Ukraine's being able to succeed in some time. So you have the situation in the Black Sea, you have the situation with the ports, you have hundreds of thousands of people possibly taken to Russia because the West is working on some new genocide narrative in the Donbas region after sidestepping the real genocide in the Donbas region for 8 years, which is why Russia went into Ukraine in the first place. So you have that. You have the depopulation of the East. So this is the Western media just echoing whatever Kiev says. And Russia making progress in the East. And they're having a meltdown because this is Ukraine losing after all of these people have invested heavily in trying to convince themselves and the world that Ukraine is winning. How? What is your assessment of what it needs to get Putin to reverse? And again, Kirby has no real answer for this. Ukraine is losing, plain and simple. They're losing, and there's nothing that can be done to fix this. Kirby says, we've been talking about howitzers recently. We've committed now over 100 howitzers, and most of them are actually not only in Ukraine, but actually in the fight, according to the Ukrainians who tell us that. And in the other in the other briefing, they admit that all of this hardware is already at the front line. It's just not making any difference. And these multiple launch rocket systems are not going to make any difference. Not make any difference. Kirby, then he does this thing that everyone in the West loves to do. They like to assign to Russia objectives that Russia never had going into Ukraine. And then because Russia didn't have these objectives, they're not even trying to achieve them. And so the US, it's a straw man. They can put up these objectives and then say, oh, look, Russia hasn't achieved any of them. But actually, Russian President Vladimir Putin, he clearly stated that the actual objectives were securing and protecting the Donbas region, which we're watching that. We're watching Russia completely destroy Ukrainian forces in the Donbas and liquidate them permanently. They will not threaten the Donbas region again. So that's one. The demilitarization, which is part of securing the Donbas region, and the denazification of Ukraine. And Kirby, he admits that, yes, Russia has taken at least one major city, Mariupol, and that city is completely denazified now. So what it is it's a briefing where the Western media, they're angry at John Kirby for not telling them what they want to hear. Someone else asks Kirby, about the javelins and how they claim that they've seen footage of javelins actually destroying tanks. I have not seen much of that, and they're wondering where's the footage of the howitzers destroying Russian targets. And I've talked about the M777s. Russia has the ability to find them, track them, target them, and attack them. There's footage of that. I've seen footage of that. At least one battery was found and attacked by a munition dropped from a drone and also by counter fire from Russia's artillery. Someone else asked a question about Severodonetsk, and they're asking about, can Ukraine prevent it from being encircled? The answer is no. Again, John Kirby doesn't answer any of these questions. He tries to go around in a circle and go everywhere except answering the question, because if he has to answer the question, honestly, it's not going to be what these people want to hear. He ends his briefing, his last briefing as Pentagon spokesman, by saying, the brutality, the vulgarity of the war that Mr. Putin is waging on the Ukrainian people and the deceitful management of information that he has tried to put in place, shutting down a free flow of information. Seeing all of that reminds him of how important it is to have a free press and what the free press is doing. And it's just so ironic that in his last briefing, the media is berating him because he's not telling them what they want to hear. And they're having this meltdown over the fact that Ukraine is not winning, which was obvious from the beginning that they weren't going to win. It was they themselves who were conducting a deceitful management of information that led many people to believe that Ukraine was winning, which is why people are so shocked now that they see obviously they're not winning. And to be honest, Russia for the most part has been very honest throughout this conflict. Things that they don't want to talk about, that the West would usually lie about, they just don't talk about it. Things that they talk about are more or less accurate. And if you were just listening to Russian media statements, you should always do your own analysis, but let's just say for the sake of argument, all you listened to are Russian state media statements and claims. You would not be in the state of shock that you see a lot of people in the West in right now, as their fantasy world collides with reality at light speed and smashes it into a million pieces. Now, the second briefing, this was conducted on May 26, 2022, was given by a senior defense official. They admit that Russia is making incremental gains in the Donbas region, which is what they've been doing every single briefing. Every briefing that I've listened to or read from the Pentagon admit that Russia is making progress and that Ukraine is not. They said that 190,000 of the 209,000 rounds for the M777s is already in Ukraine. 80 of the 108 M777s are already on the front line and making no difference, by the way. They sent 11 Mi-17 transport helicopters to Ukraine. That was fewer than they started the conflict out with. And all of these switchblades, these kamikaze drones, they're already delivered and apparently not making any difference. The Pentagon senior defense official says 419 Ukrainians have been trained as basic operators of the M777s. 30 have taken a maintenance course and 17 have taken an advanced maintenance course. There's 20 Ukrainians training on the Phoenix Ghost. This is some drone that they have alluded to being similar to the Switchblades, which are making no difference. And then they talk about the Harpoon missiles because it's usually a shipborne system. And Ukraine has no ships, so they got to put them on a truck and put them on the coast. That's the best they can do. So he says, so there's some training that needs to be done on how to use the Harpoon. It was not designed for coastal defense. It was designed for anti-ship warfare, ship-to-ship warfare. So this is a relatively new application of the missile, and therefore we know that they're going to need a little bit of training on that. And there's 20 being trained for that. And again, this is grasping at straws. They're talking about these Harpoon missiles breaking the Black Sea blockade. If Russia was blockading the Black Sea, and you have these Harpoon missiles, and you manage to sink every single surface vessel in the Russian Black Sea fleet, you are now left with Russia's submarines. They have submarines in the Black Sea. Harpoon missiles are useless against them. And so the blockade is still on, I guess. Someone asks this senior defense official about Ukraine's claim that 30,000 Russians have been killed, and there were a couple of other ridiculous statistics, unverified statistics that they were asking this official about. And he refused to get into the statistics, obviously, because it would reveal the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense as utter liars. And what he does say, though, is that Russia still has the significant amount of the majority of their capability left to them, despite all of this fighting, after all of these months of fighting and all of these supposed losses. The Pentagon is admitting that Russia still has a significant amount of the majority of their capability left to them. Those were his exact words. And this senior defense official, he's another one who repeats this myth that there's some sort of offensive taking place around Kharkov. And we looked at the pro-Ukrainian live map that shows you that there's no offensive going on there. So they're clinging to this because there's literally nothing else they can point to show anything at all resembling success for Ukraine on the battlefield. Okay, so some things to watch. Watch the Donbas region. This is Russia's primary focus. This is their primary objective. Everything else is secondary. An advance on Nikolaev, no. Taking Kharkov, no. They're not going to do that. Those forces in those areas, they're doing fixing operations, or they're shaping a battlefield ahead of some sort of offensive that will take place when and only when Russia is done securing the Donbas region. They will have all of those battle-hardened forces ready to go to the next objective. Keep an eye on this. They had the Ghost of Kiev. Now they have this Ghost offensive around Kharkov. Keep an eye on that. See if anything happens. They said that it was this major offensive and it was threatening Russia's logistical lines, and it did nothing of the sort. And it's very unlikely that it will. And keep an eye out for the impact or the lack thereof of all of these Western weapons that have been sent. They are all, according to the Pentagon itself, they're all on the battlefield right now being used by Ukraine, and Ukraine is abandoning cities. They are leaving the Donbas region. Their defensive lines are being smashed, and they're doing that with all of these systems that the West has given them. And the addition of multiple launch rocket systems that do not give Ukraine any significant capability that it didn't have and then lost at the beginning of this conflict, that is not going to make any sort of difference. But let's keep an eye on it anyway. And I just want to conclude by reminding people that these heavy weapon systems, they can take weeks to learn just to be a basic operator. They could take months for an army months or even years sometimes for an army to learn how to use them in an integrated and effective manner on the battlefield as part of combined arms operations. You cannot just take one single rocket launcher and go out unsupported onto the battlefield, point it somewhere, push a button, and make some sort of success on the battlefield. It does not work that way. You have to work with all the other units on the battlefield. Everything has to be working in tandem for you to succeed on the battlefield. That is what Russia's forces are doing. And if Ukraine's forces are not doing that, they will be decimated. They are being decimated. That does it for this update. If anything significant happens, I'll do one right away, or else it'll be a couple of days before I do another one. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find my work, just in case YouTube deletes my channel. You can find my work on Rumble, Odyssey, and I'm also very active on Telegram. In the video description below, you will also find all of the references that I used to make this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You could do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month-to-month memberships, one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with other people or sending news tips and kind words, I appreciate all of that help. I could not do this work without it. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.